So I'm speaking today with renowned journalist and author Christian Caryl. Hello, Christian.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I think a good place to start would be to have you briefly introduce yourself to our readers. So please tell us a bit about yourself and your work.
Sure, well, I'm a journalist of long standing. I was a foreign correspondent for Newsweek. I worked for quite a few years for Foreign Policy magazine, and then I spent 7 years until recently working in the opinion section of the Washington Post, and now I'm just a humble freelancer again. But
Wonderful.
I'm also a frequent contributor to the New Yorker Review of Books, I should add.
Wonderful. So you wrote for Book Post on Benjamin Nathan's recent book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause: The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. You were yourself stationed as a journalist in Moscow in the 90s and before that in Berlin. Were some of these personalities and movements a part of your experience? Was their work still in the air there?
Oh, very much so. In the mid 90s, the former Soviet dissidents were assumed a great deal of importance in Russian political life. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, after um, the last hurrah of Mikhail Gorbachev and the advent of Yeltsin, these once repressed activists, the ones that were left at least, um, ended up playing quite a prominent role in Russian politics. The most prominent example being Andrei Sakharov, although he didn't live very long into the 1990s, but a couple of other people of his generation did. And what was really fascinating to see is something that kept going through my mind as I was reading Ben's excellent book was that, I knew several of the people who um, grew out of that generation of original Soviet dissidents in the 1960s. The most prominent example being Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was one of my writers at the Washington Post. I don't know if you know about him. He's a brilliant, brilliant um, critic of Vladimir Putin, probably the most powerful critic of Vladimir Putin after the late Alexei Navalny. And Vladimir Kara-Murza was imprisoned shortly after the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine because he insisted on going back to Russia and being in his home country, even though he knew he was running a great personal risk by doing so. And he was thrown into jail almost immediately and spent, um, I think, in total about a year and a half in prison, almost 2 years, I think, in prison in Siberia under very, very harsh conditions, needless to say. And yet, during that period, he managed to have to write columns for us at the Post and have them brought out to the West so that we could publish them. And he ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for that work.
Hmm.
And that was very moving to me, not only because of that extraordinary personal fate and the extraordinary idealism and defiance of this person, but it was also very moving to me because Vladimir is a student of the Soviet human rights movement. He's made films about it, he's written about it, he knows it inside and out. So when I read Ben Nathan's book, I felt, even though he was writing about events that took place in the 1960s, they felt it was kind of like reading about, I don't know, Bob Dylan or the 60s activists in the United States. You read this book feeling very aware of the impact that these dissidents had on the generations that came after them and how profoundly they influenced the fate of Russia, even if at the time not many people paid much attention to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually does sort of segue into my next question, which is just like, in what ways are you seeing the legacy of this movement in today's Russia or in Ukraine as well?
Well, I think there are all sorts of examples. I mean, Alexei Navalny was one such example. He had a much more, I think, uh, skeptical view of the Soviet human rights movement, which, during the 60s and 70s did not achieve any tangible changes in Soviet life. We have to make that point. They did not affect Soviet decision making in any way, shape, or form, except that sometimes they caused serious publicity issues for the Soviet leadership. So, for example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn had to be kicked out of the country. I mean, that's what they chose to do with him because he won the Nobel Prize for Literature and he became such a thorn in the side of the Soviet government that they ended up having to kick him out of the country. But that said, he didn't really affect the politics, the policies of the Soviet Communist Party in any appreciable way. He was just, he was just a very loud and powerful voice against communism. He was, in that respect, he was very influential. But you know, Navalny had a point when he said basically these were people sitting around in their kitchens talking about things. And a lot of Soviet citizens didn't really understand what they were talking about at the time and didn't care because they were worried about finding groceries and, they had more urgent everyday concerns. So in that respect, there's a very strong strain of skepticism about these folks, these activists in modern day Russian society. And in the 1990s, there was the issue that, Russia became a democracy, not a very elegant or effective democracy. I should talk living in the United States, which is going through its own problems of democracy at the moment. Um, and the 90s were very chaotic and not a great time for the overwhelming majority of Russians. People lost their savings, they had a hard time getting by, there was turmoil. The Soviet Union fell apart completely and families were divided. Most Russians don't look back on the 90s with a lot of nostalgia. And a lot of that was blamed on the Democrats, the people who had brought democracy to Russia and who were very often seen as puppets of the United States and the other Western powers. That's all very important to understand about the legacy of these Soviet dissidents, right? The
Right.
legacy is complicated, but most importantly, they demonstrated a kind of extraordinary idealism and courage that is still very inspiring. In 1968, a handful of these activists went to Red Square and made a public protest against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And they unfurled banners, and almost before they could do that, they were arrested by the KGB and sent away. Most of them were sent into exile or ended up in labor camps. But that little hopeless, ineffective protest continues to echo down into the present day. And now a lot of Russian activists are protesting the war in Ukraine. And Vladimir Karamazov, who I mentioned earlier, cites those activists, those 1968 activists all the time. Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who was one of them, who figures very prominently in Ben Nathan's book, basically said, we're trying to kind of salvage the honor of the Russian people by showing not everyone is in favor of this horrible crime, this invasion to suppress democracy, the nascent democratic movement in Czechoslovakia. And so we can at least say that someone stood up for the right thing. And that's a very inspiring statement, which I think continues to animate a lot of the anti-war protests that's going on in Russia today. And, whatever you hear from other people, there actually is quite a lot of that protest. It's very effectively suppressed by the FSB, the modern day inheritor of the legacy of the old KGB that suppressed the dissident movement. And yet, opposition continues. And that opposition has, I think, a genuinely important symbolic value. Yeah, again, fine, it hasn't resulted in changes in Putin's policies. He hasn't pulled the troops out of Ukraine. It's still incredibly important, right?
Right. Absolutely. And now to just sort of move on a little bit to some of your newer work. You're writing now on the Austrian journalist Gita Sereni. What drew you to her story, and what sort of relevance do you see for readers today? She was drawn to writing about atrocities and the moral apparel of that. Is that right, would you say?
Yes, I'm quite fascinated by Gita Sereni. She was born an Austrian, but she became a British citizen, I should mention. Um, she, received one of the highest distinctions of the British. government. They award these distinctions to people for her work as a journalist. But she was born in Austria in 1921. And I am indeed fascinated by her. I first discovered her work when I lived in Berlin in the 1990s. I came across this book called Into That Darkness, which was based on a series of interviews she did in the early 1970s with Franz Stangl, who had been the commander of Treblinka, the extermination camp in southeastern Poland, one of several extermination camps that the Nazis used to wipe out primarily Polish Jewry. Yeah. Millions and millions of Polish Jews died in these extermination camps, as did Jews from other countries as well. And she interviewed the man who ran this operation for the little over a year this camp was open. It accounted single-handedly for about 1 million people killed, right?
Mm.
That's how over the top it was. And it was one of these camps. There were basically no survivors from the camp. There were only a handful of survivors at the end of the war because unlike Auschwitz, where a lot of people did labor under very, very brutal conditions but managed to survive, there are almost no survivors from the extermination camps, Belzec, Treblinka, Sobibor, because they were just death factories. They brought the people in and they exterminated them, and that was it.
Mhm.
And she managed to interview the guy who ran this camp. And I highly recommend the book to you and your listeners because it really is one of the most extraordinary documents of the 20th century. We have, as I like to say, we have libraries full of testimony from Holocaust survivors. And that is a very good thing. I'm very happy that we have those libraries full of testimony from survivors. Those are vital documents. We have to have them. We have almost no testimony from people who carried out the genocide. Now, why is that? It has several reasons. One is that the people who ran, for example, the extermination program in Poland, a lot of them died by the end of the war because Himmler, the head of the SS, actually was perfectly happy to see them all killed. So he sent them into difficult situations, mostly to suppress partisans in Yugoslavia. He was kind of happy to just let them be offed, right? And then after the war, some of them escaped to South America, like Franz Stangl, the subject of Guido Cerini's book. Very few of the people who were involved in the extermination program actually ended up in front of courts. Some of them were captured and executed right at the end of the war and the years immediately following the war, like the commander of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss. But whatever the reasons, we've had very little opportunity to actually interview those people about what they thought they were doing and why they did it. And we interviewed the Israelis interviewed Adolf Eichmann when they put him on trial in the early 60s. Some people were interviewed for the Nuremberg Military Tribunal in the 1940s, right after the war. But those are trial situations, right? So a trial interrogation is not really the same thing as an interview from a, shall we say, receptive listener, or in Gita Srini's case, a professional journalist. So this book that she wrote about Franz Stangl, I think, is really an extraordinary document. It's filled with all kinds of insights into, he tried to evade. He did try to sell his own case. He was hoping that by talking to her, he was going to promote his own appeal, which he wanted to register with the West German authorities. I forgot to mention, she interviewed him in prison after he'd been sentenced to life by a West German court. He lived in Brazil for a time and then was brought back to West Germany to stand trial. And it's an extraordinary book because Cerini tells him at the beginning, I want to find out basically what makes you tick. I'm not here to be your friend. I'm not here to, help you advance your legal case. I'm here to understand why you did what you did and what you think about it. And it really is a hair-raising book, as you would expect, I hope. But it's really a somewhat unique document. I mean, we do have some other conversations, interrogation transcripts with people who are involved in these things, but it really is to this day quite a unique book. And that's the book that I first came across by her. Then I discovered her other books, and it made me, you know, really, it got me really interested in her career as a journalist.
Yeah, fascinating. Um, is there any other projects you are working on right now that you would like to introduce our readers to? And in addition, where can they look to find your work?
Well, the book that I wrote before this is called Strange Rebels, 1979 and the Birth of the 21st Century. And it's kind of fun. It wasn't, I can't claim it, you know, it didn't make the bestseller list or anything. It was quite a, I think, an eccentric book. It wasn't really a mass market kind of book, but it lives on. I published it about 10 years ago, and it lives on. It has quite an extraordinary life because people keep stumbling back to the year 1979, which I argue in the book was a really fundamental year because of several things that happened that year. Among them, the election of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the revolution in Iran, and the start of market reforms in China, right? All those things can be dated back to that year. And I really would contend that we are living with the after effects of those events and the other events that I describe in the book. And it is funny how people keep stumbling across the book and bringing it up. It lives on, which is very gratifying to me. Um, but my main project at the moment is this book about Gita Sarini, which is a biography. It's been unexpectedly complicated because I had to gain access to her personal papers, which were not easy to access, but I did manage to access them in the end, and I found this wealth of material. I mean, she had such an extraordinary, crazy life. Um, and the reason why I'm so obsessed with her is because I didn't mention this before. Um, but you did sort of allude to it in your question, is that she was obsessed with the nature of evil. Okay. She, this became kind of a leitmotif of her career as a journalist. She was very, very, very fixated on understanding why people do terrible things. And in some ways, she was a bit of an activist because she very much wanted her explorations of the motivations of evildoers to have a real world effect. You know, she really wanted to have people understand how to stop these horrific acts that people were committing. And that fascination with the nature of evil is the reason why I think it's still worth writing about her. I'm not writing about her just because she had a cool life and she was a great journalist. She was, by the way, a path-breaking female journalist, which I think is very important to the story. Although, like many female journalists of that generation, she wasn't much of a feminist and didn't see herself as, you know, breaking paths for other women. Um, I think that's a very important part of the story, but I think the thing that keeps her work alive and makes it relevant to the present day is precisely that issue of evil. You know, why do people kill? Why do people commit these terrible crimes? And I think that's an issue that's very much with us today. You know, we see soldiers committing war crimes in Ukraine, members of the Russian army. We see Vladimir Putin ordering these horrific attacks on civilians in Ukraine, absolutely mind-boggling stuff. Um, we see horrible things happening all around the world, and you have to ask yourself, when are we finally going to get a handle on this persistent issue of, you know, bringing people to account or preferably preventing these things from happening in the first place? And just finally, to close this bit, another book that I hope to be publishing soon, I haven't even begun the process of offering it to a publisher, is a novel that I've written about St. Paul, the man we now know as St. Paul, Paul of Tarsus, who was in the views of some the man who really invented what we now think of as Christianity. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration myself, but it's not far from the truth. And having spent a lot of time traveling in the places where Paul the Apostle himself traveled, I became really fascinated by this whole issue of um, what he thought he was doing and how he did it and how people at the time would have seen it. So I've written a novel very different from anything else that I've done in my career. I have, in fact, written a novel about describing through the eyes of an educated person at the time in the city of Ephesus on what is now the west coast of Turkey, what Paul's thing looked like. You know, my hero encounters Paul kind of accidentally as part of a political intrigue. And then we understand sort of what the early Jesus movement, as scholars call it, looked like to someone at the time. And I hope that it will. I just hope that it will be a lot of fun. It's really a world building. For me, it's a world building experiment. I don't have any kind of, I'm not trying to teach anything or, present some kind of thesis or some kind of program or idea. I just want to put the reader back in that universe and let them stew in it and see what comes out of it. And it's been an enormous amount of fun, I have to say. But I do think I agree with Harold Bloom, the literary critic who taught at Yale when I was a student at Yale in the 1980s, that Paul, the Apostle Paul of Tarsus, is probably one of the most influential people who ever lived, and that he had a particular and distinct kind of genius, even if in the modern day we tend to regard him as something of a fanatic or a crazy guy, But those things often belong to genius, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to thank you so much for speaking with me today. Your words have been very illuminating and interesting, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak with me.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me.
Thanks.